A simple question turns tense when John Cena pushes back. Sonny Hostin is caught off guard. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? One that starts as a thoughtful discussion, but slowly shifts into something far more serious. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice, and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment begins the way many episodes of The View typically do, with a calm introduction and a clear topic that feels relevant but not immediately controversial. The panel is seated, the audience is settled, and there's a familiar rhythm in the studio. On this particular day, the conversation is centered around public responsibility, celebrity influence, and how public figures respond to social issues. As the camera cuts across the panel, you can see Sonny Hostin leaning slightly forward, engaged and ready to guide the discussion with her usual measured tone. Sitting across from the panel is John Cena, dressed in a tailored suit, composed, attentive, and clearly prepared for a serious conversation rather than a light promotional appearance. At first, the exchange feels balanced. Sonny introduces the topic by referencing recent conversations around accountability in entertainment and sports. Her tone is calm but firm, the kind of delivery viewers of the show are used to. She frames her question carefully, asking John about the role celebrities play when addressing sensitive issues publicly, and whether they have a responsibility to take stronger or more consistent stances. John listens closely. His posture is upright, hands loosely folded, occasionally nodding to signal that he's following her point. When he begins to respond, his tone is steady and thoughtful. He talks about the complexity of being in the public eye, explaining that while public figures do have influence, they also have limitations. He emphasizes the importance of understanding context before speaking, suggesting that not every situation allows for a simple or immediate response. At this stage, the conversation still feels like a typical exchange of perspectives. The audience is quiet, attentive. A few nods can be seen among the panel as John speaks, indicating that his points are being considered. Sonny responds by acknowledging his perspective but gently pushes further. She points out that silence or delayed responses from public figures can sometimes be interpreted as indifference. Her tone remains professional, but there's a noticeable shift, a slight tightening in her expression, a more direct gaze. She's no longer just asking, she's challenging. John takes a brief pause before replying, something that doesn't go unnoticed. He looks toward the panel, then back at Sonny, choosing his words carefully. He explains that reacting too quickly can sometimes do more harm than good, especially when the facts are still developing. He stresses that responsibility also includes ensuring that what you say is accurate and constructive. There's a subtle change in the room at this point. The audience remains quiet, but the energy feels more focused. One of the co-hosts shifts slightly in her seat, watching the exchange more closely now. Another host briefly glances toward Sonny, as if anticipating where the conversation might go next. Sonny follows up, this time with a more pointed example. She references moments where public figures have taken clear and immediate stances and were widely praised for doing so. Without raising her voice, she questions whether waiting can sometimes come across as avoiding accountability. John's reaction is calm, but you can see a slight change in his facial expression, a tightening around the eyes, a more deliberate pace in his breathing. He leans forward just slightly, signaling that he's about to respond more directly. When he speaks again, his tone is still controlled, but there's a firmness to it now. He clarifies that choosing when and how to speak isn't about avoidance, but about responsibility in a different form. He explains that being thoughtful should not be mistaken for being passive. He adds that every situation is different, and applying a single expectation to all public figures can overlook important nuances. As he speaks, the camera briefly cuts to Sonny, who listens without interrupting, but her expression suggests she's preparing a follow-up. The other hosts remain quiet, allowing the exchange to unfold without stepping in. The audience reaction is subtle but noticeable, a few murmurs, a slight shift in posture among those seated. It's the kind of reaction that suggests viewers are starting to form opinions, even if they are not expressing them out loud. Sonny responds again, this time narrowing the focus. She acknowledges the idea of nuance but questions where the line is drawn. Her tone is still measured, but there's a clear persistence in her approach. She's not backing away from the point she's making. John listens without interruption, maintaining eye contact. When he responds, he does so with a level of clarity that stands out. He reiterates that accountability doesn't always look the same from the outside as it does from within. He emphasizes that making a meaningful contribution to a conversation sometimes requires preparation, reflection, and understanding, not just immediacy. At this moment, the exchange has clearly shifted from a general discussion to something more focused and personal in tone. It's not confrontational in an aggressive sense, but it's undeniably serious. Both participants are holding their ground, and neither is dismissing the other. One of the co-hosts finally leans in slightly, offering a brief comment that attempts to balance the perspectives being presented. It's a small intervention, but it momentarily diffuses the tension, giving both Sunny and John a chance to reset. Even so, the underlying disagreement remains. The conversation has moved beyond surface-level commentary and into a deeper exploration of responsibility, perception, and public expectation. As the segment continues, the pacing slows just a bit. Each response is more deliberate, each pause more noticeable. The audience is fully engaged now, watching closely as the discussion unfolds in real time. And while the tone remains respectful, there's no question that the conversation has taken a more serious turn than it initially promised, setting the stage for what's about to come next. As the conversation resumes, there's a noticeable shift in pacing, not abrupt, but steady enough that anyone watching closely can sense the discussion is moving into more specific territory. The brief attempt by another co-host to soften the moment has passed, and the focus returns naturally to the exchange between Sunny Hostin and John Cena. Sunny takes a slightly different approach now. Instead of framing her next point as a general question, she narrows in on the idea of influence, particularly how large audiences often look to public figures for guidance during uncertain or controversial moments. Her tone remains composed, but there's a clear intention behind her words. She's pressing for a more definitive stance. She explains that in today's media environment, hesitation can quickly be interpreted as a lack of concern. While she acknowledges that every situation is complex, she emphasizes that the public doesn't always see that complexity. What they see, she notes, is whether someone speaks up or stays silent. As she speaks, the camera briefly cuts to the rest of the panel. One co-host nods slightly, another watches John closely, hands folded, as if weighing how he might respond. The audience remains quiet, but the room feels more attentive than before, the kind of silence that suggests people are leaning in, not pulling back. John listens without interrupting. His posture remains steady, but there's a subtle shift. His shoulders square a bit more, and he leans forward just enough to signal engagement. When Sunny finishes, there's a brief pause before he begins to respond, and that pause carries weight. He starts by acknowledging her point directly. He doesn't dismiss it, and he doesn't try to redirect the conversation. Instead, he agrees that public perception is powerful and that audiences often expect immediate clarity. But then he carefully pivots, explaining that expectation doesn't always align with responsibility. His tone is calm, but there's a firmness now that wasn't as present earlier. He explains that reacting quickly to satisfy public demand can sometimes lead to incomplete or misleading statements. He points out that when someone has a platform as large as his, or others in similar positions, what they say carries consequences that go beyond the moment. As he speaks, there's a noticeable stillness among the panel. Sunny maintains eye contact, her expression attentive but unchanged. The rest of the hosts remain quiet, allowing the exchange to continue without interruption. John continues, elaborating on the idea that responsibility includes knowing when to speak and when to wait. He emphasizes that taking time to understand a situation doesn't mean avoiding it. It means approaching it with care. He adds that there have been instances where quick reactions have had unintended effects, and that's something he actively tries to avoid. The audience reacts subtly, a few nods, a quiet murmur that quickly settles. It's not applause or disagreement, just a sign that the point has landed in some way. Sunny responds by leaning slightly closer to the table, signaling that she's about to challenge the idea more directly. She acknowledges the importance of accuracy, but raises a concern about consistency. She points out that some public figures seem to respond quickly in certain situations but take more time in others, and that inconsistency can raise questions about intent. Her tone remains even, but the question is clearly more pointed than before. It's not just about timing anymore, it's about how those decisions are perceived. John takes a moment before answering. This time, the pause is a bit longer, and it's noticeable. He looks down briefly, then back up, as if organizing his thoughts. When he speaks, his voice remains controlled, but there's a slightly more direct edge to it. He explains that from the outside, it may appear inconsistent, but from the inside, those decisions are often based on different levels of understanding and involvement. He says that not every issue holds the same context for every individual, and that expecting identical responses across different situations doesn't account for those differences. As he finishes, there's a brief moment where neither of them speaks. It's not uncomfortable, but it's noticeable, the kind of pause that only happens when both sides are considering their next move carefully. One of the co-hosts shifts in her seat and offers a short comment, suggesting that the conversation itself reflects how complicated these expectations have become. It's a neutral observation, and it briefly opens the space for a less direct exchange. But Sunny returns to her point, this time focusing on the audience's perspective. She explains that viewers don't always have access to the reasoning behind these decisions. What they see is the outcome, whether someone speaks or not, and they form opinions based on that. Her tone is still calm, but there's a persistence that's hard to miss. She's not raising her voice or interrupting, but she's clearly holding her position. John nods as she speaks, acknowledging the point. When he responds, he does so with a level of clarity that draws attention. He agrees that perception matters, but he adds that perception isn't always accurate. He explains that part of the challenge of being in the public eye is knowing that your actions will be interpreted in ways you can't control. As he continues, his tone becomes slightly more emphatic, not louder, but more deliberate. He says that trying to meet every expectation in real time can lead to decisions that are more about optics than substance, and that's something he actively tries to avoid. The audience reacts again, this time with a slightly more audible murmur. It's still restrained, but it reflects growing engagement with the discussion. Sunny listens closely, her expression thoughtful but firm. When she responds, she does so by bringing the conversation back to accountability. She acknowledges that perception can be flawed, but she emphasizes that public figures still have a responsibility to consider how their actions are received. At this point, the exchange has settled into a rhythm, each side presenting their perspective clearly, neither interrupting, but both pushing the conversation forward with increasing precision. The rest of the panel remains mostly quiet, though their body language suggests they are following closely. One host briefly glances toward the audience, then back to the table, as if gauging the room's reaction. The pacing of the conversation slows even further, with each response carrying more weight. The initial ease of the segment is gone, replaced by a focused, thoughtful exchange that feels more like a serious discussion than a typical talk show segment. And while the tone remains respectful, there's no question that the disagreement is becoming more defined, not through raised voices or interruptions, but through the steady, deliberate way each point is being challenged and defended. As the segment continues, it becomes clear that this isn't a moment that will resolve quickly. Both Sunny Hostin and John Cena are fully engaged, carefully choosing their words and maintaining a level of composure that keeps the conversation grounded, even as the tension continues to build beneath the surface. As the discussion continues, the tone remains measured, but there's a clear sense that both Sunny Hostin and John Cena are now speaking with greater precision. The earlier back and forth has settled into something more focused, where each response is not just an answer, but a deliberate clarification of position. Sunny leans slightly forward again, her hands resting closer together on the table, signaling a shift toward a more direct line of questioning. She acknowledges the points John has made about timing and responsibility, but she introduces a new layer, the idea of impact beyond intention. Her voice remains calm, but her wording becomes more exact. She explains that while intention matters, the impact of silence or delayed response can still carry consequences, regardless of the reasoning behind it. She frames it in a way that reflects how audiences interpret public behavior, noting that people often respond emotionally first and analytically later, if at all. The camera briefly cuts to John as he listens. His posture remains composed, but his expression tightens slightly, not in frustration, but in concentration. He nods once, acknowledging the point, but doesn't interrupt. Sunny continues, giving a specific example of how public figures can unintentionally influence narratives simply by choosing not to engage immediately. She emphasizes that in fast-moving news cycles, the absence of a voice can sometimes be as noticeable as a statement itself. There's a subtle reaction from the audience, a few heads nodding, a quiet shift in the room. It's not agreement or disagreement in any obvious sense, but it shows that the point resonates enough to hold attention. When John begins to respond, there's a noticeable pause beforehand, slightly longer than before. He inhales, leans forward just a fraction, and then speaks with a tone that remains calm but carries more weight. He starts by acknowledging that impact is real, and that he doesn't dismiss how audiences feel in those moments. But then he carefully distinguishes between reacting to impact and being guided by it. He explains that while emotional responses are valid, decisions made under pressure to satisfy those responses can sometimes lack the depth needed for meaningful contribution. As he speaks, his delivery becomes more structured, almost as if he's laying out a framework. He talks about the importance of aligning words with understanding rather than urgency. He points out that when public figures speak too soon, they risk adding confusion instead of clarity. The panel remains quiet, allowing him to finish without interruption. Sunny watches closely, her expression attentive but unchanged. John continues, expanding on the idea that responsibility includes resisting the pressure to respond purely for visibility. He explains that there have been moments where he chose not to speak immediately, not because he didn't care, but because he wanted to ensure that what he eventually said would be meaningful and accurate. There's a slight murmur in the audience again, a bit more noticeable this time, though still restrained. The atmosphere remains respectful, but the engagement is clearly building. Sunny responds by acknowledging his perspective once again, but she shifts the focus slightly. She brings up the idea of trust, how audiences build trust with public figures based on consistency and transparency. Her tone is still even, but there's a subtle firmness that suggests she's pressing toward a core concern. She explains that when audiences don't understand the reasoning behind delayed responses, it can create uncertainty. And in some cases, that uncertainty can lead to assumptions that may not align with reality. As she speaks, one of the co-hosts briefly glances toward the audience, then back at the table, as if gauging how the conversation is landing. Another host adjusts her posture, leaning in slightly, signaling increased attention. John listens without interruption. This time, when he prepares to respond, there's less of a pause. He seems more ready, more direct. He agrees that trust is important, but he adds that trust should be built on substance rather than timing. His tone is steady, but there's a clear emphasis in his words now. He explains that speaking quickly doesn't necessarily build trust if the message lacks depth or accuracy. He then addresses the idea of transparency, noting that while it's valuable, not every decision or process can be fully visible to the public in real time. He emphasizes that there are often factors behind the scenes that influence when and how someone chooses to speak. As he finishes, there's a brief silence, the kind that feels intentional rather than uncertain. The conversation has reached a point where both sides have clearly defined their positions. Sunny takes a moment before responding, which is slightly unusual given the earlier pace. When she speaks, her tone softens just a fraction, but the substance of her point remains firm. She acknowledges that not everything can be visible, but she reiterates that public figures operate in a space where perception often shapes reality. She explains that even well-intentioned decisions can be misunderstood, and that's something that comes with the territory. At this point, the exchange feels less like a disagreement and more like a careful negotiation of perspectives. Neither side is raising their voice or interrupting, but both are clearly standing by their viewpoints. One of the co-hosts finally steps in again, offering a brief observation about how both perspectives highlight the challenges of being in the public eye. It's a measured comment, and it momentarily broadens the discussion beyond the direct exchange. The audience responds with a light ripple of acknowledgement, not quite applause, but enough to signal appreciation for the balance. Even so, the focus quickly returns to Sunny and John. There's a sense that the conversation hasn't fully resolved, that there's still more to unpack. Sunny shifts slightly in her seat, her posture still forward, still engaged. She prepares to continue, but this time her tone carries a hint of reflection, as if she's considering how to bridge the gap between their perspectives. John remains steady, attentive, and composed. His body language suggests he's open to continuing the conversation, but also firm in where he stands. The pacing slows again, each moment stretching just enough to emphasize the weight of what's being discussed. The audience remains fully engaged, watching closely, aware that the conversation has moved well beyond its initial scope. And while the tone remains respectful and controlled, the underlying tension hasn't disappeared. It's simply settled into something quieter, more focused, and more deliberate, setting the stage for how the conversation will either resolve or continue to unfold in the moments ahead. As the segment moves forward, there's a subtle but noticeable change in how the conversation is being handled on set. The earlier rhythm, where each point was answered almost immediately, gives way to something more measured. The pauses are slightly longer now, the tone a bit more reflective, and the attention across the table more concentrated. Sunny Hostin takes a brief moment before continuing, her expression thoughtful but still focused. When she speaks, her tone is steady, but there's a shift in how she frames her next point. Instead of pressing directly against what John Cena has said, she begins by acknowledging the broader challenge, that being in the public eye requires constant judgment calls, often without complete information. It's a slight recalibration, and it changes the feel of the conversation almost immediately. She then moves into a more specific concern, bringing the discussion back to how audiences interpret not just what is said, but what isn't. She explains that for many viewers, especially those who feel personally connected to certain issues, silence can carry emotional weight. Her delivery is calm, but there's a quiet emphasis in her words that suggests she's speaking from a place of lived observation rather than abstract theory. The camera cuts briefly to the other hosts. One nods slowly, another keeps her gaze fixed on the table, listening closely. There's no interruption, just a shared understanding that the conversation has reached a deeper level. John listens carefully, maintaining eye contact. His posture remains upright, but there's a slight shift. His hands move closer together, resting on the table now instead of loosely apart. It's a small change, but it suggests a more focused engagement. When Sunny finishes, the pause that follows is longer than before. It's not awkward, but it's noticeable enough that the audience becomes completely still. Even the background movement in the studio seems to fade as everyone waits for the response. John begins speaking with the same calm tone he's maintained throughout, but there's a clearer sense of conviction now. He acknowledges the emotional weight Sunny is describing and agrees that public silence can be interpreted in powerful ways. But he draws a distinction between emotional expectation and responsible action. He explains that while he understands why audiences feel that way, he believes that responding purely to emotional pressure can sometimes lead to statements that don't fully reflect the reality of a situation. He emphasizes that responsibility, in his view, includes resisting that pressure when necessary. As he speaks, there's a subtle shift in the audience, not a reaction in the traditional sense, but a kind of collective attentiveness. It's clear that people are processing what's being said rather than reacting immediately. Sunny responds, this time with a slightly softer tone, but her point remains intact. She agrees that emotional reactions alone shouldn't dictate responses, but she adds that emotional impact is still part of the reality public figures operate within. She explains that for many viewers, the timing of a response isn't just about information, it's about acknowledgement. That word, acknowledgement, seems to settle into the conversation. John nods slowly, as if recognizing the weight of that point. When he replies, he does so carefully, choosing his words with noticeable precision. He says that acknowledgement is important, but he believes it can take different forms. He suggests that not all acknowledgement needs to happen immediately or publicly, and that sometimes the most meaningful responses happen outside of the spotlight. This is one of the first moments where the discussion shifts slightly away from direct disagreement and into a more nuanced space. It's not that they are agreeing, but they are beginning to explore the edges of each other's perspectives. One of the co-hosts leans in at this point, offering a brief observation about how the conversation reflects a broader tension in media today, the balance between speed and substance. It's a short comment, but it adds context without disrupting the flow. The audience responds with a light ripple, a few scattered nods, but the overall tone remains quiet and focused. Sunny picks up from there, building on the idea of acknowledgement. She explains that while private actions may be meaningful, public figures often operate in a space where public acknowledgement carries its own significance. She notes that for many viewers, seeing someone speak publicly can validate their concerns in a way that private actions cannot. Her delivery is calm, but there's a renewed firmness in her voice, not confrontational, but clear. John listens without interruption. When he responds, there's a slight shift in his tone, still composed, but more direct than earlier. He says that he doesn't disagree with the value of public acknowledgement, but he cautions against equating visibility with effectiveness. He explains that in some cases, public statements can become more about meeting expectations than creating meaningful change. He adds that he tries to focus on actions that align with his understanding of a situation, whether or not they are immediately visible to the public. As he finishes, there's a brief moment where the room feels evenly balanced, both perspectives clearly stated, neither overpowering the other. Sunny takes a breath before responding again. This time, her tone carries a slight note of reflection. She acknowledges that actions matter, but she reiterates that for many people watching, visibility is part of how those actions are understood. The exchange at this point feels less like a disagreement and more like a careful unpacking of a complex issue. There's no escalation in volume, no interruptions, but the seriousness of the conversation remains fully present. The rest of the panel continues to observe, occasionally shifting in their seats, but largely allowing the two to carry the discussion forward. The audience remains engaged, their reactions subtle but consistent, small movements, quiet murmurs, a steady focus on the table. As the segment begins to approach its final stretch, there's a sense that both Sonny and John are aware of the time and of the need to bring their points towards some form of conclusion. Sonny slightly adjusts her posture, sitting back just a bit, though her attention doesn't waver. John mirrors that shift in a subtle way, his shoulders relaxing slightly while maintaining eye contact. The tone now is more reflective than before, but the underlying tension hasn't disappeared. It's simply evolved into something quieter, more thoughtful. And as the conversation continues, it becomes clear that the final moments will not be about winning or losing the argument, but about how each perspective is left for the audience to consider once the cameras move on. As the conversation moves into its final moments, there's a natural shift in tone across the table. The intensity that built gradually throughout the segment doesn't disappear, but it settles into something more reflective. Both Sonny Hostin and John Cena appear aware that the discussion is nearing its close, and their delivery reflects that awareness. Sonny takes a brief pause before speaking again, her posture easing back slightly from the forward-leaning position she held earlier. When she resumes, her tone carries a sense of summary rather than challenge. She acknowledges the complexity of what they've been discussing, the balance between timing, responsibility, perception, and impact, and she frames it in a way that brings the conversation back to the audience. She notes that viewers often look for clarity in moments like these, even when the issues themselves are not simple. Her voice remains calm, measured, and professional, consistent with the tone she's maintained throughout. There's no attempt to revisit earlier points directly, but rather to recognize that the conversation has explored multiple sides of the same issue. John listens closely, his posture now slightly more relaxed than before. When he responds, he does so with a tone that mirrors Sonny's, less focused on defending a position and more on reinforcing the perspective he's shared. He reiterates that responsibility, in his view, includes being thoughtful about when and how to speak, even when that approach may not always align with public expectations. He adds that he understands why audiences want immediate responses, and he respects that expectation. But he emphasizes that his priority remains ensuring that whatever he says is grounded in understanding and intention. His delivery is steady, without any noticeable shift in emotion, but there's a clarity that suggests he's comfortable leaving his position as it is. There's a brief pause after he finishes, and for a moment, the table is completely still. Then one of the co-hosts steps in, offering a short closing remark that acknowledges both perspectives. It's the kind of transition that signals the segment is wrapping up, measured, neutral, and designed to bring the conversation to a close without forcing resolution. The audience responds with light applause, not overly loud or prolonged, but enough to reflect engagement and appreciation for the discussion. It's the kind of reaction often seen when a segment has been more thoughtful than entertaining, more reflective than reactive. As the camera widens slightly, Sonny offers a final comment, thanking John for his perspective and for engaging in what she describes as an important conversation. Her tone remains warm and professional, consistent with how daytime talk show segments typically conclude, even after moments of tension. John responds with a nod and a brief expression of appreciation, thanking the panel for the opportunity to discuss the topic. There's no lingering tension in his demeanor, just a composed acknowledgement that the conversation has run its course. The segment transitions smoothly, with the show moving toward its next topic. But even as the discussion ends on air, the impact of the exchange lingers, both in the studio and beyond. Inside the studio, the audience settles back into a more relaxed posture as the show continues. The earlier stillness gives way to a return of normal pacing, subtle movements, quiet conversations between segments, and the familiar rhythm of a live broadcast moving forward. Behind the scenes, however, the conversation doesn't end quite as quickly. Moments like this often carry into brief off-camera exchanges, not necessarily confrontational, but reflective. It's common for hosts and guests to share a few words once the segment concludes, clarifying points or simply acknowledging the discussion. While those moments aren't visible to viewers, they are part of the natural flow of live television. After the episode airs, the response begins to take shape across different platforms. Viewers who watch the segment in real time start sharing their thoughts, some focusing on Sonny's emphasis on public accountability, others aligning with John's perspective on thoughtful response and responsibility. Clips from the View segment begin circulating online, with short excerpts highlighting key moments in the exchange. In some clips, Sunny's questions are the focus, particularly the parts where she emphasizes perception and acknowledgement. In others, John's responses stand out, especially where he speaks about the importance of timing and substance. The reactions are varied, but largely measured. Some viewers express appreciation for the calm and respectful tone of the discussion, noting that it allowed both perspectives to be heard clearly. Others engage more directly with the points raised, debating where the balance should lie between immediacy and accuracy in public responses. Social media discussions reflect this divide. Some comments emphasize the importance of speaking up quickly, especially in moments that carry emotional weight. Others support the idea that taking time to understand a situation can lead to more meaningful contributions. In the days following the episode, the segment continues to be referenced in broader conversations about media expectations and public responsibility. It's not presented as a conflict or controversy, but rather as an example of how nuanced these discussions can be when given space to unfold. There are also follow-up conversations in other media spaces, where commentators revisit the exchange and explore its implications. Some highlight the professionalism shown by both Sunny and John, noting that the discussion remained respectful even as it became more serious. Others focus on the substance of the arguments, using the segment as a starting point for larger discussions about communication in the public eye. Neither Sunny Hostin nor John Cena makes any immediate public statement specifically addressing the exchange, which in itself aligns with the tone of the conversation they had. The discussion remains what it was, a live, in-the-moment exchange that reflects differing perspectives rather than a definitive conclusion. Over time, the moment settles into the broader flow of talk show history, one of many conversations that capture how public discourse continues to evolve. It doesn't stand out because of raised voices or dramatic escalation, but because of its steady, thoughtful progression and the clarity with which both sides express their views. And for viewers, that's often what leaves the strongest impression, not the volume of a debate, but the substance of what was said and how it was handled. As the episode fades from immediate attention and becomes part of the ongoing stream of daily broadcasts, the takeaway remains open-ended. Some viewers leave with a stronger appreciation for the need for timely acknowledgement, while others come away with a deeper understanding of the value of measured response. And that balance, between expectation and responsibility, is exactly what made the conversation resonate beyond the moment it aired. If you watched this exchange, what stood out to you the most? Do you agree more with the idea of speaking quickly, or taking time to respond thoughtfully? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.